The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everybody, this is Sophie from English Australia. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar on the growth mindset. I'm not going to talk very much because I'm losing my voice, but I would just briefly like to introduce Denise Metzger, who's our presenter today. Denise is the Educational Manager, Global Languages and Training at UNSW Global in Sydney. And she presented this session at the English Australia conference. It's backed by popular demand. It was very well received at the conference, and so she's presenting it as a webinar for us here today. Thanks, Denise.
Thanks, Sophie.
Sorry, Denise, just before you start, everybody, we've got the webcams activated today. If they're too large on your screen, you can just make them smaller by hovering over the bottom right-hand corner and moving them in the way you would with an image in Word, trying to sort of make it smaller that way. All right, Denise, over to you.
All right, thank you, Sophie. I'm very happy to be doing this again. I'm glad I got some good feedback at the conference. So just to give a little background as to what I do at UNSW Global, there are lots of departments and languages. In the area that I work in, we have general English and business English, exam preparation, teacher training, customized programs, specialized English for law and STEM sciences and different subjects, and some academic English. Also modern languages like Italian, Chinese, French, etc. So it's a very dynamic place to be, and I'm very happy to be here with this team of people. I chose this topic because it is really about something I care about, and I think all educators care about, which is potential and how we see potential, which I think as teachers we do, that's our job, but also ways in which we might actually be limiting our own view on potential within ourselves and, more importantly, within our students or the staff we manage. So I'm just going to change the slide. Sorry, one second. Okay, so before we get into the theory of growth mindset, I just would like to do that very teachery thing of checking in first with ourselves. So before we start, I'd like you just to ask yourself, and you don't need to do anything with this, you can write it down if you'd like to, but just start thinking, getting in the right headspace or mindset. When did you last feel smart? So what were you doing? What was the context for that? Why do you think it made you feel smart? Also, what are two things you think you've always been naturally good at? So your whole life you've had a narrative, I'm very good at this, I can do this, this is me, I've got it, always have been great at it. And similarly, two things you think that you're naturally bad at, which I think is also, sadly, an easy list for a lot of us to make. Growing up thinking, well, I just can't do that. That's not me. It's not my skill set. I'm not going there. All of these questions are things that we'll talk about in the theory, and we'll come back to them at the end and see if maybe we've changed our perception of our answers to them. But what we're going to talk about today, more specifically as an outline, we're going to start with an IQ test. So I know you think, oh, good, I get to sit here and listen to a presentation at my computer at work probably, but we are going to start with something around an IQ test. We're going to then move on to the theory, growth mindset theory. What is it, and why do I say that it might be an important thing to consider? Now, growth mindset theory is not without controversy, which I'd like to just go ahead and acknowledge. And I'm not suggesting that this is the end-all or be-all for how we think about learning and development, but it certainly has a lot for us to consider. And the last bit will be, how can we do it? Meaning, how can we try to encourage a growth mindset in ourselves, but also, importantly, for our students so that their growth can become development and learning. All right. Now this part, I think, Sophie, if you can help me a little bit, I'd actually really like to hear if anyone has a guess as to who this might be.
Okay.
So if you can chat in, is that possible for people to sort of do a little chat?
Type your answers into the chat box.
Okay. Now, a couple hints. This person is very famous. Another hint is that this is not the IQ test, so don't worry if you don't know.
Okay, we've got Abraham Lincoln. We've got Vincent van Gogh.
Nice pronunciation, Sophie.
You like that better than go?
Yeah, I did. All right, good. Most people I've talked to said
more Abraham Lincolns coming through as well.
Oh, how exciting. I tend to think it looks a lot like Leonard Nimoy, who played Spock. But anyway, we will come back to this, and I'll explain why this was being asked in the first place when we get to the end. But we're going to talk about the IQ test a little bit more. Now, this IQ test, let's just try to change the slide again. Cool. This IQ test is not actually going to measure our intelligence together as a group, don't worry. What I do want to do is talk about the IQ test at a meta level. So it's a meta IQ test we're doing here. Now, there are two ways on a continuum that we can think about intelligence and what it is. On the left-hand side of the slide, you can see people have a certain amount of intelligence and can't do much to change it. On the other hand, you can say people can always substantially change how intelligent they are. Now, I think most of us probably alternate between believing these two different things about intelligence, depending on our context. But if you had to, and you don't have to chat this in, but I do want you to think about it. If you had to say which of these two views you hold about what intelligence is, for most people, most of the time, what would it be? So thinking about your own students, thinking about you as a learner, thinking about people you meet when you're out on the street or on the bus or in the cinema, any experience, would you say that intelligence is mostly you have what you have, that's it? Or it is fundamentally, substantially able to change and be different? Okay, so now I'd like to think, what would we think that the person who wrote the intelligence test, the IQ test to begin with, would have said? Now, when I've asked people this before in live conversations, not on a webinar, people would normally say, I would think the person who wrote the IQ test believes the one on the left. People have a certain amount of intelligence. Let's see what it is. That's what it is. But actually, the writer, the initial writer of the IQ test, did not believe that. His name was Alfred Binet. Now, this test has been changed since it was initially written, but fundamentally it's remained the same. The purpose of this test was that in the early 1900s, the Paris Board of Education decided they wanted a test to help and identify students who were underperforming in their schools, with the express purpose of then being able to change the curriculum and then reassess the students with the same IQ test in order to measure their now increased intelligence or growth or development or learning. So the purpose of this test was never to pigeonhole students and say, well, those are the fast track and those are the ones who need more help. It was never actually about that. It was meant to diagnose intelligence at a point in time with the purpose of being able to change curriculum to be able to measure an increase in intelligence, which I think is an interesting way to start this conversation. So, to put it differently, the IQ test was originally designed not to judge people's ability from the start, but to notice where there are gaps and then be able to assess when the gaps were eventually being bridged. And I think this isn't just the purpose of the original IQ test, but this is what education broadly aims to do. This is what we do. Now, growth mindset is very much this philosophy that we need to notice where gaps are and understand that bridging gaps is actually possible with instruction, support, training. Now, it's not saying that everyone on that line, on that picture, might end up reaching that red mountaintop and everyone can achieve the same exact level of great success in every single thing. It's not saying that, but it is saying that everyone can, with training and support, develop and get better. So putting it a different way, Alfred Binet would say that people can actually increase their basic intelligence. Now, that's a belief. That's a belief about intelligence, which I happen to share. And I think most teachers share, or at least think that they share. And to move this now technically into the growth mindset theory, we can again think about intelligence in these two ways. One, intelligence or ability is innate. You can do what you can do. Intelligence or ability can be developed. So to put the terminology around it from growth mindset, the first one where we see it as being innate is a fixed mindset. The other one where we see the possibility of development is the growth mindset. Now, this mindset theory was originated by Carol Dweck, who is a psychologist, currently, I believe, working at Stanford University in the US. She actually started this research decades ago. And this has been something that's quite well known, very, very commonly discussed in mainstream education circles in the US for a long time, but something that only, I believe, in the last year has started gaining traction in our field in Ellicotts in Australia. Now, Another way to sort of exemplify this, or to start thinking about why it's important, is if we think about the fixed mindset as being innate ability and intelligence, then it's always very personal to who we are. It's something we identify with on a very personal level. Whereas in the growth mindset, we're not saying my intelligence defines who I am, because my intelligence can change, so I can change. So it's not who I am, but who I can be with some effort. Now, we have a lot of pop culture icons that help to continue to propagate this idea of intelligence or ability being something you're born with. You have it or you don't. So lots of child prodigy stories like Mozart might make us think, oh, well, if I can't play music like Mozart when I'm 10 years old, maybe I shouldn't bother. I just don't have it. And people can give up. Sometimes people might also look at athletes like Michael Jordan and say, well, that's another example. I can't play basketball like him. I wasn't born with his DNA. But Michael Jordan's actually a really good example of a growth mindset, because what's interesting about him, probably many things are, but this is the one thing I know that's interesting about him, is that he actually didn't make the high school varsity team for basketball when he was in high school. He wasn't good enough to make his high school team. I think we all know from our own experience how many kids, most kids, almost all kids, would just quit and say, well, I guess, I'm no Michael Jordan. I can't play basketball. I'm not going to do it. But he didn't take that approach. He realized he wasn't good enough and then continued to train with strategic feedback from coaches who knew what to do and how to help him in order to become one of the top performers in the field. So when we talk about effort, it's not who I am, it's what I can be with effort. That's the essential crux of the growth mindset. The effort isn't just the doing. It's not just try again. But very importantly, it's effort that comes with strategic input from somebody who can guide you and coach you. So a teacher who knows, and that you actually try to do by incorporating feedback. Okay, so I'm going to get into a little bit of research here to help exemplify the impact that the mindset can have on learning. One of the studies that I read about when I was preparing for this from the research was Dweck and her team decided to put a group of fifth graders into a research study where they would be experimenting with puzzles. And they told the children, okay, in this, we're going to give you a lot of puzzles. After you finish one, if you'd like another one, just raise your hand and we'll give you another one. And of course, what was happening was that each puzzle was increasingly more and more complicated. Now, before they went into this study, they actually separated the students into two groups and they primed them. So one group was primed, Group A, by saying things like, you're good at puzzles. The other group, Group B, was primed with things like, you can get better if you try and ask for help. So they were being primed for fixed and growth mindset. Now, it's interesting to think about how they would have used language to get the students into this kind of fixed mindset about puzzles or growth mindset about puzzles. For the fixed mindset group, they would have said things like, okay, we're going to do some puzzles. They're going to be very hard, but you guys are smart kids. You can definitely do it. Don't be shy, just get in there. You're so smart. You're going to do it. It's going to be fun. Let's go. Which I think on the surface sounds like really good motivational teacher talk, and I'm sure I do that all the time with students. I know I do. The growth mindset would have been different, starting out similarly. Okay, we're going to do some puzzles. It's going to be hard. But then the motivation's different. Instead of concentrating on how smart they are, they would concentrate on the fact that there was support offered. So this is going to be hard sometimes, but we're here to help you. You will definitely find a moment when you don't know what to do. If you try and you're not sure and you need help, ask for help. We'll come and help you, and we'll teach you how to do it on your own the next time. So you can keep doing it and keep having fun. So what's interesting is what happened with these two groups of kids who then went in to do the puzzles. In the growth mindset team, they were interested in continuing with the puzzles no matter how well they did on the first one or the second one or the third one. They would last the entire session, always ask for more, asking for help, learning how to do it. And at the end, they went away quite happy, saying things like, oh my gosh, tell my mom where she can buy these puzzles. I want to keep doing it. It's hard, but I love it. It's fun. The other group only remained interested in the activity if they did very well on the first puzzle. If they didn't do well on the first one, they weren't interested at all, and they'd stop. And what else is interesting is that no matter how well, let's say they did well on the first one, at some point it would get too difficult for them to do on their own. They were not volunteering to ask for help. They didn't want to ask for help. And not only would they quit, they'd often make up lies to explain why they were quitting. So it wasn't actually that they couldn't do it. They wouldn't admit that, but they would say, oh, this is really boring. I've actually done it 10 times. I have these at home. Don't need it. Because they were afraid of losing face. Because, and here's the important thing I think that I took away from this, was that if you tell a student, you're smart, you can do this, well then it doesn't take a genius actually to reverse engineer that and say, well, if I can't do this, then I guess I'm not very smart. And if that's what's being valued, you don't ever want to admit to someone else that you're not smart. So they didn't, and they didn't ask for help. Okay, so I just want to take a second here because I think that's a really interesting piece of information to try and personalize a bit. Try and match this theory a little bit with our own personal or emotional experience to see if we can integrate it into something that makes sense for us. So when might we have walked away? And again, you don't need to answer this to anyone, but you can think about it. When might you have walked away from something because it was too difficult? Now, if you weren't interested, who cares? But maybe you were. So sometime when you were a kid and you walked away from a hobby or an interest because it became too difficult and you didn't want to show that you didn't know how to do it. Or sometime as an adult, and I think as an adult it's probably more often career related. Or to get touchy-feely for a second, it could be relationship related. So when does that affect you? Because it probably has, which means it probably does to your students. And we're just going to move back into the research now. Now this is another case study, and this one is more explicitly linked to our own context, so I think it's even more interesting. This time they went to a group of students who were non-native English speakers studying at Hong Kong University. They were all studying courses that were being delivered in English, so they had a real reason to have a high level of English. But the students that they approached for the study were recognized as having a fairly low level of English, and those that would benefit from having additional language lessons. Now this time they didn't prime the students because they were adults. They gave them questionnaires, and through a series of different questions, they were able to try and discern who amongst them had a quite fixed mindset around learning, particularly to language learning, and who had a growth mindset. So the questions for fixed would have been things similar to, I believe that intelligence is what it is, it doesn't really change. And the growth would be things like, I believe intelligence can be substantially changed with effort. So what happened? They said to these students, if you'd like, we can give you free extra English classes to help you with your lessons. All you have to do is sign up and say yes and come to the class. Now, the growth student said, yes, of course, please. Of course I want English lessons. They'll help me with my university studies. Thank you. Interestingly, the ones who had been identified as having a more fixed mindset said no thank you more often than not, which seems astounding. Why would someone say no to free help for something that matters as much as getting through university in a successful way? Now, there are two ways we can sort of theorize or think about how the fixed mindset might lead to that. One is that they might be thinking, well, you know, I'm just not good at languages. That's an ability that I have that's fixed, that doesn't change. I'm not good at languages, so why bother? Would be the next step from that thinking. Or they might think, well, I'm a really smart person, and it's important to me, it's important to my family and my friends that they see me as a smart person, and so all I have to do is be smarter. I don't need more lessons. Now, what's really interesting to me is to try and start reflecting on how I might, or how people I work with might at times get into this our own fixed mindset around students, which, as I've just said here, fixed mindset will create a non-learning environment. So let's finish this sentence. This student in my class just doesn't even try to learn, right? I've heard this from teachers. I've definitely said this about students myself. She doesn't even try to learn. What could be a follow-up? Let's see, isn't motivated, doesn't want to be here. Or she's lazy, she's used to things being easier, bit of a princess. Or, you know, she just doesn't get how we teach here. This is an active participation thing. You can't just show up to class and learn a language. Or maybe even, she just isn't that smart. Now that last one hurts a little bit, I think, if you care about teaching and learning. And I don't think that we say it directly, but I have heard it many times in many schools indirectly. And we hear it indirectly whenever we have a student who we're surprised hasn't done that well on an assessment or in a class activity. And then afterwards we go, I don't get it. She's one of the smart ones. But if there's a smart one, there's definitely some people in your class you kind of think are a little bit of the dumb ones. So I think we're doing this a little bit, if we're being honest with ourselves, and saying that there's some kind of good at languages, not good at languages, smart fundamentally, not smart fundamentally, like to help people learn. But what's even more problematic here is that if we look at these sort of sentence endings again, what are we doing? Well, we're saying that the student's not trying to learn because she doesn't want to, that's her intent, which we can't change. Or she's not trying to learn because she's lazy, which is her personality. And insofar as personalities exist and aren't always changing, we can't change that. Or she doesn't get that, the way we teach requires participation, which is her culture, which we cannot change, her background or her culture. And then she isn't that smart, which is her intelligence, which I think a lot of people, when they say that, are thinking that's not something I can change. Of course, growth mindset theory would suggest intelligence can change. So how about ending the sentence differently? What if we started saying things like, she's not trying to learn because she might not think that language learning is something she can do. She might have a fixed mindset around the fact that people can learn how to learn a language. She might think that she's not smart and that can't change, but it can change. She might feel personally judged, that this is her innate ability, and therefore if she can't do it, it's all about her and who she is, and that's demotivating. So what can we do instead? Instead of this, how can we help change this belief? That is something we can absolutely change. So another example of how this comes out in our classrooms, now this is particular to a university context. So this is DEP, or direct entry program students here. I was thinking about how we often give feedback to students in, let's say, a direct entry program, which is very high stakes, to students who have failed a midterm. So we really need them to understand why they're failing, so that they can change something, so that they can pass this course and continue going on to university. It's really important for the student. Now, in these situations, we might have a student like student A, who we say, okay, we're going to give you some feedback. They come, they sit down, pen in hand, ready. What do you want to tell me? I'll do whatever it takes. They take good notes, they ask some questions, they walk away, and you know that they're going to be fine, or that they should be. And probably in our mind, we're thinking, they'll be okay because they're smart, or they're motivated, they get it. But actually, probably what's happening is that student has decided that if they listen to your feedback and they go and do something about it, something can happen, which is a growth mindset. And they probably will be okay. A fixed mindset student's probably the one who sits there, maybe arms crossed, hardly looking at you, or not really making eye contact. And you just wonder, is this student getting any of it? Are they listening? Do they care? It could be, of course, that they don't care, right? That's highly unlikely. It could be that they don't understand you. Again, highly unlikely. It's most likely that they don't actually believe that the feedback you're giving is going to make a difference. And that's a mindset issue. So let's have another look at how these students, I'm just going to flip ahead a little bit, how these students work internally, what's happening. If you're a fixed mindset student and you're receiving a lot of feedback because you've just failed a very important midterm, and it's giving you the sense that you might fail this whole course and your whole life might now be different, you might be thinking, well, this is the problem because I just don't have what it takes. And from that, we get students who are in a great deal of stress or depression, or they start exhibiting really poor choices like cheating. We might get fixed mindset students. It's not that they think they don't have what it takes. They think they're really smart. And now they're confused why they're not doing well, because so far being smart has always been the answer, and that's been enough. So they think, well, I just have to keep being smart, and somehow I have to be smarter. It's not that I have to try or do anything differently. I just have to be the smart person I know that I generally am, neither of which is going to be particularly helpful to the student. So then I was thinking, well, what specific language do we use or should we use when we're giving feedback to students that can either encourage growth or a fixed mindset, remembering the things that we saw in the fifth grader case study with the puzzles and the Hong Kong students, and now thinking about that feedback. So here are 4 things that I would say a lot in class as a teacher to students. Well, that was a really good effort. Yeah, good job. Or I might say, you're really clever. I wouldn't say clever, I'm American. You're a really smart student. I know you can do this. Or you might say, look, keep working. Just keep working, keep doing it, keep going. You're going to get better. Or I might say, you know what, gosh, you're a natural. I can't believe you did that activity so fast. That's amazing. All of which I really think in some ways seems like great feedback. It seems positive and motivational. But if we think about growth mindset theory and the things we just talked about, we might have a different view. So growth mindset theory would question a couple of these and absolutely say, try not to do some of these. So the question mark on you made a good effort would be just to remember that praising effort is not enough. It's not the fact that you do something. It's the fact that you do the right thing. It's that you're actually incorporating feedback. You're making strategic effort based on someone's expert advice. So I can sit and write the same 10 words in Russian that I remember again and again for 5 hours, but I'm not going to learn how to write anything better in Russian. I need to do something that's strategic, not just do something. Similarly, the same with if you keep working, you'll get better. Well, maybe, but maybe they need some guidance to work in a different way in order to get better, and that's our job. The other two are interesting because they're things I'm actually now trying to monitor how often I say them. I don't think that we should never tell someone they're smart, but I think we do have to be careful with how often we're using language around being innately smart and innately talented at things, because it does continue to reinforce a fixed mindset where your ability to understand or to do something is then really related to who you are naturally as a person, rather than understanding the fact that intelligence and ability, whilst some people are born with higher amounts, your prodigy, your Mozart, everyone has the ability to get better. So we could start thinking about other things to say in feedback. I can see in this essay you're really making connections with the language that we just learned and the language we learned a couple of weeks ago. You need to keep doing that in order to reinforce these connections you're making. It's a very different thing to say to a student, I think. Or, and this one I like, I've just given you a lot of feedback. Let's imagine the direct entry program student. I'd like you to walk away for 10 minutes, reflect on it, and in your own words, write the 3 things that you think you can do that incorporate that feedback. That can be a new way for you to practice this language that makes sense for you. I think at this point, I might just also say that because this is a psychological theory, another psychological theory I kept thinking of when I was reading about it because it seemed contradictory to me, was that a lot of psychologists would say the best predictor of a future behavior is a past behavior. And to some extent, that's really true, right? But this theory is saying that we need to understand that that is a prediction, not a limitation. So if we just view someone's past abilities as the absolute predictor of what they can do in the future, well, that's not necessarily true. We're really limiting what that person is capable of only based on their past experience. One of the ways we might get students on board with this, the ones who might have a little difficulty understanding how to change their mindset, or staff members, is to, of course, like anything we learn, make it explicit. Workshops around mindset, workshops around what learning looks like and how learning works, and metacognition could be helpful for this. I think that when we define learning, most people would give some kind of a definition like learning is acquiring new knowledge, it's acquiring new skills. And yes, of course, that's true, right? But I think that what educators are more and more commonly switched on to now, and students need to become or could benefit from becoming more and more switched on to, is that learning is actually a physical change in the brain. And the more we can demonstrate to students what's happening in their brain when they learn something new, that they've now formed a connection from one new idea to an idea that was already kind of there, made a connection that's actually physically changed the structure of their brain. And by doing that again and again and again, it does literally increase or change their intelligence, that this is real. Now, the controversy around growth mindset is that there's not maybe enough science to prove that this mindset theory is, the end-all be-all of how people operate and can learn. Fine. But there is a lot of research that definitely shows us that the physical changes in the brain that happen with learning are real and do lead to different kinds of intelligence, and that our intelligence itself does and can change with learning. So I would suggest showing that to students and getting them on board with it. Now, the next bit I'll just talk about is how this also affects management, people who are doing some kind of leadership role in a school that's not necessarily teaching. And I think it's equally important here. One, because if you're managing or leading a team of people, to some extent, you're doing the same thing where you're trying to help people learn something new or step into a role that might be new and things like that. So here's how it might work. Thinking about how growth mindset can help management, first is in HR. So when you're interviewing someone, you'd probably benefit from hiring someone who has a growth mindset in some way, especially if you're hiring a teacher. We definitely want to hire teachers who believe in students' potential and don't believe that students come as a ready-made product and nothing's ever going to change it. So what kind of questions could you ask in an interview to get an answer into whether or not they actually do believe in potential for learning and development, and they believe it's their job to help to inspire that and not just expect the student to show up with it ready to go. Also in management, I think this can help us when we think about the feedback we give to staff. So if we're constantly praising our staff's ability based on their innate intelligence or skill, then we might be limiting their mindset. And also thinking about where we back away from challenge and growth in our own teams. Because we probably do that for ourselves and with the people we manage when things feel hard. So with the growth mindset, I think the most important thing I'm sort of taking away from it now is that it has to recognize that learning requires something to be new, which requires something to be difficult for you. So if you're finding something difficult, there's a good chance you're actually in a moment where you're learning. So another thing to think about here is if you hire a lot of naturals, you're looking for people to step in and know how to do the role right away because they're just really smart, they're really, really talented, then I think this theory would suggest you also need to seriously think about how you support them to take risks. Because this theory suggests that people who tend to be highly intelligent or talented at a fairly early level in their lives without having already experienced a real need to have challenge and growth tend not to take many risks because they tend to feel good when they're doing well, and they'll always do that. So like anyone, you'd rather do something that feels good, right, and that you're good at and where you're shining than something that you're uncomfortable with because it's new for you. So in our own selves, I think we need to reflect on how this affects us. Where are our own fixed mindset areas? Now, again, this theory would say that we don't all have one or the other. We don't operate living our lives through the world thinking only in a growth mindset or only in a fixed mindset way, but rather that there are certain contexts or environments which we naturally apply one or the other. So someone might be thinking, they have a fixed mindset in terms of what they can do physically. I can't develop physically any more than what I have. That's just what I am. But emotionally, I'm open for growth. And other people will be the opposite and think, I can change my body easily, but I am who I am. I feel how I feel. The other thing we need to reflect on is our own ability to risk failure, because if we're not doing that, then we're not challenging ourselves, and our ability to actually take feedback and use it. Okay. Now, Carol Dweck does have a little trick here, which I've mentioned. Name your fixed mindset and talk to it. I haven't done that. I don't think I'm going to do that. But I do think it's a good idea and someone else might like it. The concept here is that if you identify areas in your life where, for example, at work, something's new for you and it's hard, and you've never done something that felt this hard for you before, and you don't know if you like it, because why would you? It's not nice to do something hard, is it? You can name that feeling as your fixed mindset and talk to it. So you might say, that's Edna. I can hear Edna in my head, and shut up, Edna, I'm going to do it anyway. You can use that if you'd like to. All right, we're going to move on. So I was really surprised, but also extremely happy, I have to admit, that people thought that might be Abraham Lincoln, because God help me, I don't think it does. But I drew it as Abraham Lincoln, and this is one of many things that I've been doing this year to actually try and develop a growth mindset around a few areas where I thought I had no ability, one of which is drawing, which I think I still don't have a great ability, but it's getting better, which is the point. I actually started doing this before I started researching growth mindset. But I've been doing a lot of these. I'm filling a whole sketchbook. I'm almost done with Abraham Lincoln's. At that stage, I realized, I don't know how to draw ears. So you got headphones. At that stage, I realized I didn't know how to draw hands. So we got mittens and a teapot. Thanks, Sophie. There's a whole series of these. You're welcome to come to the art show, which will happen. But it gets better and better in a sense, or you could say it just continues to develop. So that's quite a bit of fun. Now I'm just going to come back to the beginning of our presentation again and say, when did you last feel smart? Now, when someone asked me that a couple months ago, right before I was putting this presentation together, I had immediately something up. That's the last time I felt smart. And it was me doing something that I'm good at, I think, naturally. Because of course that feels really good. But this theory would say, why don't we try thinking about us being smart and using our intelligence at the moments of growth, which means the moments where we don't feel like we've got all the answers and it's coming easily and this is great, but actually the parts where we're being challenged, where we're learning. And then for those two things you're naturally good at, well, good for you. Good. And if you'd like to, I'm sure you can continue to get better. And the two things you feel you're naturally bad at, well, possibly those are things you don't care about at all, so it doesn't matter. But possibly that's something that you'd actually like to be able to do better, or understand better, in which case I think maybe there's a time to change your mindset around it. If you think I'm naturally bad at yoga and you don't care about yoga, well, no harm done. But if you think I just can't do yoga, but gosh, I wish I could, well, guess what? You can. You can. You might not be the best yogi ever, but you can definitely get better. And the thing that's holding you back is probably your own mindset, at least in some part. So a takeaway from this would be, in order to continue to grow ourselves, but also very importantly to continue to inspire our students to grow and continue to inspire staff and other people we work with to grow, we need to make sure we don't just always do the things where we're doing them really well, but put ourselves in the position to do things where we don't know how to do it well yet, and to get help from people who do, to find the people who can help, the teachers, the managers, coaches, whoever, ask for that help, listen to it, and actually have strategic effort in order to improve. The magic word being that maybe you can't do it yet. Yeah, that would be a growth mindset. Just ending a lot of sentences with that. Well, no, I can't really do that well yet, but there's probably a way that I could. And that's my presentation on the growth mindset and how I am finding it helpful at the moment and how I think others might also find it helpful. Now, I think there is time for some questions. So, Sophie, how does this part work?
Yep, so if people just type their questions in again to the chat box.
And in the meantime, thank you for coming to my presentation, and I hope it was at least a little bit helpful.
I'll just give people a minute to type their questions in. Comments as well.
Okay, and my email address is on that last slide, so if there's something you'd like to talk about or ask, but don't necessarily feel like doing now, you can email me anytime.
So someone's asked, do you think we can really challenge the mindset that some of our students have that they're really just not good at languages?
Yes. That doesn't mean that you can absolutely change everyone's mindset, but I think it's our job to try. And I think we know that as teachers. I think we know that we're meant to help our students understand that we actually do believe that everyone can learn a language. And that doesn't mean everyone's fluent at the same rate, at the same time, or in the same way, but that's possible. I think as a teacher, that's a really core fundamental belief we should have, and that we should be able to try and motivate students to do the same. I think we have to look at how we give feedback in class in terms of where the value goes. So the value being on strategic effort and development and people doing the things that are hard for them rather than just doing it right. So not giving praise just because someone was accurate, but giving praise because someone tried something new that was harder or different. I think, again, with challenging students' mindset, a lot of it comes to having that talk around the fact that intelligence is not fixed. It does change. Our brains absolutely, fundamentally, physically can and do change. But how does that happen? And what's our job in that? How do we help? That's by giving expert advice and some feedback on how to do something differently. But what's their job? Their job is to actually decide that they can. So maybe I would phrase it more like they have to decide that they can, not just believe it. I believe it. Believe it, don't believe it. Decide that you can do it, and then make some effort towards it.
Okay, great. We have another question and also a comment that have come in. The question, Does Dweck's mindset theory boil down to a particular belief about learning?
Yeah, I think it can. I mean, I'm sure that there are many ways that you could describe this, right? But I would say that the absolute fundamental belief about learning is that it's always possible. That we often think that there are some places in our life where we just can't learn. It's not going to happen. And it's because of who we are and what we have to start out with. But that's not true. There's also really interesting research in this or attached to this to say that the more often we stream students into saying you're gifted or you're on some fast track and you're the ones who need remedial work, actually has harm and can decrease learning for the students in both ways, but in different ways. So that students who are identified really early on as being gifted or just highly intelligent and capable, often because that becomes something that becomes a part of their identity, they're then less able to take a risk around losing it, risk around losing face and doing something that might demonstrate, ooh, maybe he's not that smart or she's not that great at this thing. So they tend to excel very quickly compared to students who are identified as being at a sort of lower level to start, but then they plateau. Where students at a lower level, they can have a lot of challenge growing as fast because of the way in which they're taught, with this expectation that it'll be hard for them. And, we just have to really sort of coddle and support a little bit differently. But a lot of the time also students who maybe aren't identified as being really, really intelligent or capable at the beginning can reach higher levels of achievement much later on because they've been the ones who had to learn how to learn. And I know this is true in some ways. I can have anecdotes from my own life about some of my friends and different people I grew up with in areas where they were identified as, yep, you're great at that. And then they would just plateau there, not taking further risks that might identify a need to not be as smart. And friends of mine who I saw struggle when we were kids to learn. And I think, some of us were kind of embarrassed for them that things were hard, which is horrible, but I'm just being honest. And because they learned how learning can be hard, they have continued to do it. And they're not afraid to take on a challenge or be temporarily bad at something, knowing that that's a really important part towards becoming good at it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point you make about streaming classes early on. I know my son is in year 1 and they've already streamed the students into different levels.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of really interesting stuff around streaming, and I don't think that this is trying to give an answer to that. But this theory would say that identifying students as gifted is problematic. And I read that sentence the day before my sister called me, showing me her nephew and saying, isn't it great? He just became part of the gifted program. And I thought, what am I supposed to do? I said, congratulations, and we're so happy for you, of course.
But I guess it would be really important for teachers who are teaching those gifted streams to be very aware of the growth mindset theory as well.
Yes.
I've just posted the comment that someone has made for everybody to see. Can you see that one, Denise?
Let me just have a look. The controversy, as I understand it, is about the potential for misuse.
Yep.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I think that's one thing that's controversial for sure.
So could you read that one out? Yeah, just for everybody.
Sure, yeah. The controversy, as I understand it, is about the potential for misuse. In other words, telling students that the reason they're struggling is that they have the wrong mindset, when realistically there are often other social factors which may be powerful and beyond their control, 100%, and not just other social factors, but also maybe something the teacher's doing, something the school is doing, or the curriculum's doing. I think a definite danger here is to use this to put all of it back on the student and say, well, the reason you're not learning is because you just don't want to, or you don't think you can, or you have the wrong mindset. None of that is appropriate. I think that, the positive use of this theory is that if you ever identify that you or your student or someone on your team that you manage might not be trying something because they are afraid to look dumb, that's a problem. Or if you really think that they're not doing any work to get better because they actually don't think it's possible to get better, then that could be a mindset problem. But certainly, motivation is very complicated, and ability to believe in yourself and what you can do is very complicated. the mindset theory, I think, in a positive way is good because it's so broad. You can step back and see it as a big picture, abstract way to think about how learning can happen and how we all need to believe that it's possible, right? And that actually recognizing sometimes we don't believe it's possible for people at an individual level. But that's not to say that it's not important to look at what the environment is doing to support people's belief in themselves, and to support the fact that change is possible in a broader way than just in my own mind. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting comment.
Great. Thank you. All right. I think that's it for the questions and comments. There are no more coming through. Denise, I just wanted to thank you. I think this has been a really important discussion for us in the ELICOS sector, for the implications it has for our students, but also for our staff. And I think you've given a really balanced view of the theory and how it can be applied to our context. So thank you so much for that. It was also super engaging. That time just flew by. So thanks a lot for coming in to present for us, Denise. And thank you to everybody for attending today's webinar.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great day.
Yep, great. Thank you.